Good morning, everyone. I hope that everything is okay and that you are getting used to the spring semester. We're going into this second week. A few things before, let me first share my screen with you before we begin. There you go. And a few things that I want to address before I go into today's topic. First of all, as I promised, the course website is up and running. I will make sure that you have a link for that either on Canvas or just send it directly the link to the website to your emails. What the website offers you mostly is easier access to the content of the course, mostly the slides that you have here, and you'll also have them on Canvas. But on the website, everything is in one place. You also have their links to the videos themselves. So again, if you want to use that, it's usually I'm updating that at the same day in which I'm sending you the lecture. So you can use either one of those, either one of those methods to get to the content of the course. Also, I will upload at some point later this semester some more information and additional resources that you can maybe use for this course. Number two, as I said on Monday, I begin to follow attendance starting from Monday's lecture. So make sure that you are submitting the attendance, the relevant attendance word of the day, once you finish watching the video. Every time that you watch the video, just press the link, go to the Google form, and make sure that you submit the relevant information. Lastly, this Friday, we're going to start having our face-to-face meeting, reminding you once again, those are not required meeting. You do not have to come to class. They are recommended, especially if you have questions and you want to clarify issues related to that. You want to talk about relevant issues about the course or the substance that I talked about during the week. So for each one of the sections, make sure that you follow your syllabus and come to those meetings on Friday. I will be there, of course. Okay, so as I said on Monday, every lesson begins with a quick review on what we did in the previous meeting. So on Monday, we started talking about how we construct theories. The basic argument revolved around the differences between theory and history. What does theory provide us that history does not? Why do we only use history as part of the explanations for different events? And especially the idea that if we want to project those similar events in the future, we can rely on some level of history, but we have to develop first and foremost a theoretical argument for that. Then I talked about the different components of constructing a theory, focusing on assumptions, the importance of assumptions, the benefits of assumptions in simplifying reality, but the cost that we pay in terms of we can only explain part of that reality. Then I talked also about the different elements of theory testing from an empirical standpoint. What are the different variables that we have? How do we construct a theory? How do we devise those causal relationships between variables? And then the testing of theory themselves, the need to evaluate our theory with evidence in order to test whether our predictions, whether our theoretical arguments fit with the case at hand. Also, the elements of logical consistency between the different elements of the theoretical framework that we propose. And the important, very important principle that we need to remember is the falsifiability. If we want to follow um, accepted scientific principles in our construction of an explanation, we have to be able to falsify that, which means we have to be able to state the conditions under which our predictions are not likely to materialize. That's how we can identify a scientific theory. And finally, I talked about the idea of competing explanations. One way in which our theory would be better than other theories is actually to show that our explanations is more consistent with reality than other explanations. So this was really the foundations or the basics of building a theoretical explanations when it comes to social events overall and political events also. And today we'll talk about it more. If you have any types of questions about that, you are more than welcome, of course, to come join me on office hours that are detailed on your syllabus or email me questions. Okay, today we will build on that discussion from Monday and talk about the different ways in which we evaluate theories in IR and what are the different types of theories that we have. So before we go into those specific theories, regardless of the topic that we're studying or the area that we want to research our topics, there are there's the possibility that we can use many different ways to explore an issue and offer potential explanations. And that comes under the point of levels of analysis. This represents the possibility because we can explore the same issue, a war, a negotiation, a sanctions, or any other decision from multiple angles and offer many potential explanations. We can think about that. Go back and think about what I talked about in the first lecture, in the introduction lecture, about the podcast episode in which Professor Post talked about the U.S. decision to withdraw troops from Somalia. Right? He presented there the potential from many different angles, and we can explore that decision. It could be an IR angle, it could be policy angle, it could be region-specific angle, it could be U.S. defense policy level. Those are different angles to explore the same action, the decision to withdraw the forces. So focusing on the levels of analysis in terms of building our research and doing our research is another version of this specific point. Now, before we dive into this discussion about levels of analysis in the context of international politics, what I want to do is make sure that we can define clear requirements that we have from our analytical model when we're trying to research some topics. So the first demand that we have is that we want the model to offer accurate description that's going to correlate as much as possible with reality, because if our explanations does not fit with the reality, it does not offer us much. The second point is our model needs to have the capacity to explain the relationship between different factors or explain the phenomenon in question, which means that our model needs to be valid, but we also want it to be parsimonious. Reminding you again, this concept I talked about on Monday, we want a model to be relatively simple. I don't want to have a model which includes 25 different aspects or 25 different arguments to explain why the US levies sanctions on North Korea, for example. I want to try and build this model which would be relatively simple so I can understand those type of events. And third, we want a model who's going to propose potential reliable predictions. So how those different factors that lead to this outcome that we're studying may also lead to similar outcome or similar phenomena in the future. So that's just general requirements that we have from our own analytical model that we want to build. When we want to talk, I want to start talking now about the idea of these levels of analysis and how do we approach research under this framework. So the main distinction of this inquiry is between a macro level of analysis and a micro level of analysis. Again, those multiple angles to study events. So the macro level of analysis addresses the whole system, and it explains in order to explain the phenomena that we face. On the other hand, the micro level of analysis refers to the different parts or the different components of the system. In our areas of research in social sciences, the distinction can be seen between research in sociology or social psychology and cognitive psychology, which tend to emphasize personal attributes or personality aspects in order to explain whatever it is that we want to explain, compared to a more macro level system approach that is mostly accepted when studies in economics, right? Economics want to study the entire economic system and explain different elements within the system, are looking at the system. On the other hand, psychologists tend to look at the different individual in order to explain the behavior of those individuals. So those are the two general categories that we have. And now we will start going a little bit more details about each one of them. So first we'll talk about the international system. This level refers to explaining different issues in international politics by focusing on the factors that are within the system itself. For example, we want to explain how states behave toward one another, but our focus will be on the different conditions within the system that affect the action of those states. If we want to explain how does the US behave towards Spain on some kind of phenomena, we want to look at the system itself, the system of countries in the world, in order to understand how the different conditions when it comes to that system lead to the actions taken by the United States toward Spain was my example, or Canada, or any other country. So the environment that we are focusing on is the international system. The main actors within that system are the states themselves. And looking at that levels of analysis provide us with different benefits. First is it is a more comprehensive point of view which encompasses all the different interactions within the system. And by studying that level, we learn a lot more about patterns of interactions which the system reveals, and we can generalize about those phenomena. For examples, phenomena such as the creation of coalitions or the frequency and durations of shifts in power and those kinds of actions. We can learn and understand those kinds of elements within the system itself. So what I'm actually suggesting here is that by studying the system, we can gain a lot more insights about international relations as a whole, and therefore generalize that and to explain phenomena that are happening within the system. We're trying to understand the entire system and how the system operates in order to explain more specifically phenomena that's happening within the system. So if you want to explain how do coalitions are being constructed, we can learn that by understanding the conditions that the system itself has. In this type of system, we tend to minimize the differences between states, and we view states as homogeneous. And the main benefit in that sense is it's a lot more, it provides us a lot of analytical benefits in that sense, because it's an adequate basis for testing and understanding correlations in behavior. We can more easily identify and measure correlation between certain forces, and that leads the parts of the system to act similarly. One more benefit, and that brings us back again to the discussion that I had on Monday about parsimony, and that's simplicity. By focusing on the system level of analysis and the conditions within the system, we can derive a manageable model which doesn't have a lot of methodological requirements when we come to the phase of empirical testing. A model is relatively simple. It's not going to have a lot of moving parts. So once we get to the phase of testing it with actual data, we're not going to have to go into an overly complicated type of actions. Okay. At the same time, while we have those different benefits, this levels of analysis, sorry, there it is, also has its own disadvantages. So first of all, any explanation in this level will underplay the role of its different components. In this case, the nation states as driving the outcomes. So instead of focusing on the autonomy of independence of the choice of those different actors, those different states, we're actually creating an explanation which is a lot more deterministic, because the way that states behave, and it doesn't matter in this case if that's the United States in this explanation, or France, or Germany in this case, is a function of the system itself, and it's not an independent choice by those actors. This is one of the limitations of relying on this type of analysis. Also, focusing on the system requires a high degree of uniformity in the foreign policy behavior of different states. That means that there's no room for diversity in the behavior of the parts within those states. So the decision by the United States to engage in some form of policy, so for example, again, levying sanctions on another country, is not a function of the internal dynamics within the state. So it's not the negotiations or the bargaining between members of the Congress along with the president and other members within the administration, but it is an action by the United States, and it doesn't matter how that action came to be. As another example, I promised that next week we will get to the theory of realism, but one of the most basic assumptions of realism reflects that point exactly, because the scholar that provided us with the theory of realism, his name is Morgenthau, you will read about it for next week, he argued that all members of the international system, all the states, operate with one goal in mind, and that is to pursue their interest as defined by power. So it doesn't matter what's happened within the state. It doesn't matter if there are potentially other interests for those states. They have one goal in mind, and that's to pursue those interests as they are defined by power. And this leads to the point here that Singer, in one of the papers that you had for today, mentions about the fact that when we are on some level pay less attention to internal variation within the state, this approach will tend to produce what he specifies here as sort of a black box concept of international actors. So all the states are the same. We do not care what happens between the states. Within the states, we only care on how the system leads to different actions within the states. Between the states, I'm sorry. Okay, so that is the international system. An alternative way to think about and to understand events that happen in the international politics is the nation-state level of analysis. we look closely at states and the inner workings of those states in order to understand different events. So we have here, for example, how does the uh, interactions between the United States Congress or different departments within the United States government affect the behavior or the actions taken by the president. And that's not, of course, specific just the United States. We can think about it. We have here the British Parliament. How do different actors within the British Parliament affect the actions taken eventually by the British government or the British Prime Minister? It's also relevant for countries which are not what we view as necessarily democratic countries. In this case, we have here the Great Hall of the People in China. How do different dynamics within this kind of institutions within China affect the eventual actions that China is executing when it comes to the international system? The nation state level of analysis is the traditional focus of most of the research in international politics. It's also very prevalent today. And again, the nation state in this case is still the primary actor within IR. And we look a lot more closely on what those actors or those countries are doing. Again, beginning to talk about benefits. So the biggest advantage that this approach offers us is the complete opposite of the system approach, in that it allows for a lot more variation among the states. And as a result, it encourages both researchers, both students like themselves, to study those actors in a lot more details. We do not look at all democracies as the same. So we say the United States and China, and and France and the United Kingdom all operate the same. No, we even look at differences within those states. So the composition of the democracy within the United States is very different from the composition of democracy in Great Britain. And that matters for our explanations of the behavior of those states. This kind of in-depth study of the actor is crucial for our ability to create general and then comparable arguments or explanation about the issue that we want to study. So what we are actually suggesting here is that the eventual action, and if we stay with this example that I've been dragging along with me since the beginning of lecture today, the decision to place sanction on another country by the United States is not a function of a single factor, but those are multiple elements that work within the United States government or the United States as a whole to generate this eventual outcome, which is the decision to place sanctions on North Korea, just as an example. Well, at the same time, while we have benefits, we also have costs. So the focus on actors and their internal dynamics may lead to over-reliance on those differences, and therefore that's going to limit our ability to compare and contrast any kind of observed uniformities in the behavior of the actors. So if the United States decides to place sanctions on North Korea and France also decides to do that, because the internal composition of those two democracies is different, that might limit our ability to actually compare the decision by the United States and the decision by France and many other countries for that matter. Another difficulty that this type of explanation faces is that it needs to address the dilemma of whether the behavior of the country is based on the country being goal-oriented and trying to promote any kind of an objective, or is the action an outcome of some kind of bargaining, or that the government eventually was pulled to make some kind of decision due to any kind of interactions that it had with other internal elements. So for example, one of the first actions that President Biden has made last week when he entered office was to sign an executive order leading the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement regarding climate. So the question for us in this case, if we're focusing on that point of goal-oriented behavior, is whether this is actually one of the main goal of the Biden administration, and therefore the decision to rejoin using an executive action in this case is the first step in that, or is it actually kind of a compromise that the president had to do because he was pressured by some kind of interest groups, pressured by members of his own party, pressured by other members in Congress or whatever, or in Senate or whatever that is? That's one of the questions we need to think about in this case. And this is one of the limitations because every country has its own internal dynamics, which means the explanation might be a little bit more complicated. Despite those limitations, one of the additional, we can think about it as benefits, but one of the points that Singer makes about this nation state approach is that when we're looking at it as a goal-oriented behavior, it compels us to study how these goals are being selected. So there is a need to understand the process that leads to the adoption of certain international goals that the government pursues. So again, if we're staying with the example of the Biden administration and joining the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, how is this eventual behavior comes to be? What is the process leading different elements within the government, within the administration, that leads to this eventual behavior? This kind of research requires us to pay a lot more attention to different institutions and the places where these goals are devised, whether it is different aspects within the American government, whether it is different aspects within the American system overall, whether it's different interest groups or any kind of research group within Congress, or it's something within the government. And those are affecting the process from within and provides us a much more rich explanation. So that's exactly what the argument that that Singer is placing eventually, that the nation state approach provides us an explanation which is a lot more rich, and it's a lot more satisfactory to actions that are taking place in the international system. And for that, the main price that we pay as researchers using this approach is that we need to develop and to understand the more complex methodologies, because we have to account for a lot of moving parts within the American government system in order to explain why President Biden decided to sign this executive order. We need to develop also different methodologies which would allow us to account for those different processes. Finally, in this context of levels of analysis, in this very early paper that Singer has its way back in the 1960s, he hints at the potential possibility of an additional levels of analysis. So we talked about the system, and I talked now about the nation state. Is it also possible we can explain behavior based on individual leaders? So we have here different leaders which had profound, at least a profound effect on events in their own countries and within the international system. We have here, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, which had a profound effect on actions the United States was taking early in the 20th century. Then his close relative FDR, which made the important decision related to the American decision to join the Second World War. Over here, we have two former leaders in the Middle East. On the left, it's former King Hussein from Jordan, which was one of the first Arab leaders to sign a peace agreement with Israel. And on the right-hand side is former Prime Minister Rabin from Israel, who was, again, one of the first leaders to address all kinds of issues related to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And we have here, of course, our friend Mao, which had its own set of effects on how China behaved in the international system. And the question here, and that's a question overall when we think about behavior by countries in the international system, is whether this behavior is a function of objective factors, and objective factors fit both to the system levels of analysis, especially and also to the nation state levels of analysis, or is it the perception of these specific factors by leading decision makers? Is it the perception of President Roosevelt about how the international system, how different states behave toward one another, which led him to the decision to join World War II, or is it different conditions that are happening within the system which led to the United States to join? This is a very long discussion in politics overall, and we will touch about that discussion later this semester. And that surrounds the question actually of what determines our behavior. And the main challenge, coming back again, one of the main challenges in this context relates to the concept of empirical testing and measurement, because if we accept the idea that perception is crucial in shaping behavior, that Roosevelt's perception was crucial to his decision to join World War II, how can we measure that perception? Not just measure that so we can have the data, we have to do that in a way which is systematic and accurate, so we can actually learn something from those kind of things, and not just explain Roosevelt's decision, reminding you again what I talked about on Monday. We want to explain the decision by leaders of big countries, so all kinds of big countries and their presidents. So this is one more levels of analysis, which Singer talks about very little, and we're going to talk about it a lot more later on in the semester. To summarize this section about theory construction, I want to talk about the two main levels of analysis that I talked about today, the system and the nation state. and think about the role within the theory construction process. So first, when you think about description, the system level offers a lot more of a comprehensive view in order to describe the phenomena that we're talking about or the different conditions that may lead to that. On the other hand, the nation state levels of analysis offer us a lot more depth and details because we can look at the details that led to this kind of outcome. In terms of explanation, the state level is much stronger because, just like I talked about in the previous one, it has a lot more depth, and it offers information that addresses the process leading to certain actions in the international system. And the third point here is the idea of prediction, and there's no clear distinction here in terms of which one of those approaches is more useful, because if we think about it from policymakers' point of view, they are more likely to favor the nation state levels of analysis because it offers a lot more details in order to understand why do some countries behave on some levels. Policymakers would prefer to learn the specific details leading to that action instead of just looking at the system as a whole, which provides them a lot more of an abstract answer. And that's exactly the reason why scholars are actually more likely to favor the system approach, because that allows men to generate a more general framework. As I told you, one of the main objectives of research is to generate those general explanations for phenomena that takes place in the international system. The bottom line is that we cannot necessarily select one level as better than the other. Under certain conditions, each one of them has its own set of benefits and costs. And this decision, whether I want to focus on the system level of analysis, on the nation state level of analysis, or for that matter, even the individual levels of analysis, we need to make that choice relatively early in our investigation of the issue. And when we explore the issue itself and build the way that we view it, which essentially means when we derive and when we construct our assumptions about how we're going to study that topic, that's where we have to decide whether we're going to address that topic from a system point of view, from a nation state point of view, or from an individual level point of view. To finish up that, I want to, there it is. Again, to actually, like complete the discussion about how we can use different types of explanations or different angles to study the same issue. So for example, if we want to study or we want to understand conflict between powerful states, we can actually learn about that specific phenomena from different levels of analysis, from different angles. For example, if we think about two great powers that collide, so the United States and Great Britain early in the 20th century, or potentially collide, or the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, what we call, of course, the Cold War. So if we think about it from a system level standpoint, what the argument may be is that tend to create a system which will be bipolar, which means we'll have one group of one category of countries on one side of it, countries that are more familiar or want to cooperate and work with the United States. And at the same time, we'll have another polar, which will be countries that are more likely to be closely related to the Soviet Union. So we will create a system which is a bipolar system when those two great powers collide. At the same time, we can also look at the same phenomena, think about it more in the nation state. When two states, which are relatively equal in terms of their military power and political influence, when two countries like that are facing one another, then there's a lot of internal dynamics within the system, which will lead to different dynamics of alliances. And some countries are going to join the United States. The United States would want some countries to join and be part of its alliance. And similarly for Russia, for that example. So that's how we take the same phenomena, the collision between two strong countries, and explain them using different levels of analysis. Okay, so now I want to shift the discussion to another aspect of studying international politics. And that's answer the question is, should our focus will be on devising and constructing new theories to explain the different events or to explain the system itself? Or instead, we need to focus on applying the knowledge that we already have to interpret the same events that are taking place in reality. One way that we can do that is to survey the field of research in IR and figuring what are the main trends that scholars are pursuing. So there's some arguments over the last couple of years that there's a greater push for the current research to address more more narrow questions that focus on testing specific hypotheses instead of developing a much richer or larger theoretical argument that explain the world around us. So we're focusing on applying the theories and on different sophisticated methodologies to apply the theories they already have to certain events instead of building those more general theoretical arguments. This is an argument that overall is very prevalent among scholars who are more, we can call that more of the veterans of the field, those who've been studying IR for 30 years and more. The problem is that there's not enough empirical data to support that argument. One of the things that we do know about research that exists at the moment is that a lot of the published research is focused on testing a very sophisticated hypothesis. And this is something we're going to have also to address in the future in developing more specific explanations to events that take place now and in the future. For example, we need to work on developing a very precise theoretical insights about issues which are relevant for us now in the 21st century and as we enter another decade. For example, how do we analyze and address climate change? What are some of the implications of the rise of political Islam? What are the new forms of warfare? Some of those issues we're actually going to address in this course, but all those issues should be studied from a theoretical perspective and not just as an empirical question. And that's part of the debate we still have at the moment regarding research in IR. And that's going to lead me to the next part that we're going to talk about now. In the first half of the course today and over the next 3 weeks or so, we will learn a lot about the large theoretical frameworks, the large theories of IR. Large theories were developed relatively a long time ago to explain events that take place in the international system. And I want to address one of the questions that I'm pretty certain some of you are asking themselves, and that's, why should I care? What does understanding theories such as, I've already mentioned that word, and we're going to go to it, of course, next week. What does the theory of realism do for me as I want to understand events that take place in the real world? So that's what I want to address now. One way that we can understand how IR theories are important in real life is by asking policymakers. Studies have done that by employing surveys of policymakers and scholars. And one of the main arguments that those studies are posing to us is that both camps, both policymakers and academics, view this academic knowledge as valuable and important. However, most of the evidence that we have at the moment suggests that the published research is less useful because it's based on very sophisticated approaches and methodologies that makes it a lot more complicated for policymakers. So to address that a little bit more in detail, I want to talk about the work by Avi and Desh. What they did in their research is they fielded a survey to policymakers, tested their level of familiarity, knowledge on different types of academic research, especially in IR. They also inquire about the usefulness of those studies. Their sample, they had a little over 200 senior members of the national security decision-making process that they were part of it within the senior Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and the George W. Bush administration. So before I go into details on specifically on what the different trends and the different things that they found, I want to talk overall about what they find in their research. So first of all, they show that policymakers are aware of the most recent scientific work. And as a whole, they do use those insights, but they use them under what they view or what they describe as category of background and frameworks. This is how academic research makes its contribution to actual policymaking. Policymakers has a relatively negative view when it comes to the effectiveness of academic research because a lot of it is perceived as too technical and does not offer substantive findings. One of the surprising results that they talk about is that the more educated the more educated government officials, so those who have more advanced degrees, are the ones who are least likely to be patient to use and to accept academic research, and they're very skeptical of how useful that is going to be. So in this case, education does not correlate with using this kind of information. Policymakers view academic work as mostly contributing to informal advisory roles, creators of knowledge, and they do not view academics as contributing directly to direct policy advocacy or training, for that matter, for members of the government. They also view qualitative work, which is focusing on cases, as providing more context and insight in comparison to what is actually a lot more dominant in the field, especially here in the United States, which is quantitative research. And there it is. Finally, the main limitations that one of the main limitations that they offer and that they mention in this research is related to the idea of time. If the published research is not delivered in a concise, timely, and clear manner, then it's not useful to policymakers. If I publish my research on an issue that's happening now, but by the time it's published, it's going to be a year and a half from now, it's not useful to policymakers, right? Let's look at more specific questions they ask in their research and try to understand that a little bit more. So, for example, this is one thing that they explored. This is the distribution or the level of knowledge that policymakers have regarding specific theories of IR. Some of them I've mentioned, some of them we're going to talk about. So I've mentioned the MAD strategy when I talked about Reagan's strategy on the last lecture. So as you can see, there's relatively a lot of policymakers that are aware of that. Also, we have here realism, which we're going to talk about, and democratic peace theory, which we're going to talk about. So there's relatively wide scale of knowledge among policymakers on those types of theories. Expected utility theory is a general decision-making theory, which is very prevalent in economics. And overall, it's kind of surprising on some level, at least for me, that policymakers are showing a relatively high degree of being unaware or unfamiliar with these kind of theories. Why? That's leading me to the next, the next set of results, and that's how useful are different disciplines. So economics is perceived as very useful for policymaking, even though, as I just said from the previous slide, expected utility theory, which is one of the main theories that drive economic research, is not very familiar. So there's some contrast here, but that's not the point. The point here is that discipline as economics or area studies focusing on the former Soviet Union, on Eastern Europe, on East Asia, on the Middle East, are a lot more useful for policymakers compared to disciplines such as political science, which receive much lower grades here, and public policy. So that's another set of results we have here. Just make sure that we are clear on what we see here. Those figures, what they show here is the percentage of response by the policymakers, and the different bars are represented here, of course. So this darkest bar on the left fits with this dark bar here, and that's the somewhat useful or not very useful. This is what we have here. All right, now how useful are more specific theories within political science and especially international relations? So as you can see, most of them fit to the either somewhat or not very useful theories among policymakers, whether it is mutual assured destruction, which I talked about, structural realism, democratic peace theory. So overall, those theories, while policymakers are aware of them, they don't view them as too useful for their daily work and the design of policy. Whoops, sorry. One of the points I mentioned when I talked about the general findings, that one of the main criticisms that policymakers offer when it comes to using academic research is the fact that academic research is highly concentrated on devising those sophisticated methodologies. And academic research has its own justification for that, because we are trying to build a scientific explanation. It's going to follow very clear scientific rules, everything I talked about on Monday. But that has its own set of problems, that creates its own set of problems when it comes to applying that research in reality for policymaking. So for example, while historical case studies, that is studying from specific cases that happen in history, or contemporary case studies, are receiving relatively high degrees of over 50 and over 60% of being very useful, what is very prevalent in a lot of our studies, which is something like formal models, which intend to explain behavior in more detailed manner, quantitative analysis and theoretical analysis, are less useful. So this is one of the contrasts that we're facing here, because scholars are trying to follow very strict scientific protocols in order to ensure that the research is accurate, precise, and generalizable as possible. But for policymakers, this is less useful because in many cases, this is too complex in order to follow those very specific guidelines. That's another interesting finding that they mention here. This is a figure that shows pretty nicely the idea of this contrast. That's what is being valued by policymakers. What do policymakers want to learn the most when it comes to academic research versus what researchers are mostly studying. So, and this is in terms of areas in the world. So here we have policymakers, 50% of them said that they really want to have a lot of information when it comes to East Asia. At the same time, there's a very low number of academics, and that's those two bars here on the left-hand side, that are either experts on East Asia or on one way or another study elements within East Asia. So you can see the contrast here. You can see also here, Middle East, a lot of demand from policymakers to have expert knowledge when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, and lower extent of studies on that. One of the reasons for that, again, coming back to one of our objectives when we do research on IR, we want to derive explanations which are more general. I don't want necessarily, if we're focusing on that point, I don't want to derive a theoretical explanation just to things that happen in the Middle East. I want to explain behavior that happened overall to non-democratic countries in different settings. That may be relevant to the Middle East, that may be relevant to sub-Saharan Africa. But for policymakers, because they want details on specific areas, that might not be that useful. That's the point of this specific question, and that's the point of the findings we have here. This is the breakdown of two questions: how policymakers use social science and political science arguments, and how frequently they are. So let's look at the pie here on the left-hand side. What we see here is that research in social sciences, academic research, provides mostly intellectual background and very less likely to be directly applied in the design of policymaking. So again, coming back to the general findings that I talked about earlier, and this gap that we have between theory and policymaking. Finally, this is the breakdown for the question, so how do policymakers view the place where scholars need to be? So the vast majority of them see an important role for scholars, but that's mostly as either informal advisor or creators of new information. Much less likely that they would view them as involved directly in the policymaking process or as even as formal participants. So those are a lot of different findings that they showed us in this research, overall suggesting that this clear gap exists between what IR research is focusing on and what IR research is producing compared to what policymakers hope and want IR research to offer to them. Before I continue and talk about the couple of the final things for today, I will start for today's attendance word. As I promised, in every lecture, I'm going to stop with that point. So the attendance word for today is 7, as in the number 7. And why is it 7, do you ask? Because based on earlier this week, the events that happened over the weekend, in less than 2 weeks' time, Tom Brady will have 7 Super Bowl trophies. So that's the number 7 came to my mind. Anyway, the attendance word for today is 7, as in the number 7. Let's keep going. Now, if the current data that we have, such as the research I just talked about from AV and Dash and other related research, suggests that policymakers find it very hard to use research from IR and IR theories, what can we as researchers, as scholars, can do about it? How can we make our work more accessible and more relevant? And that's what I want to talk about using the research by Byman and Crowing. They offer some potential paths that should be followed. For example, the need to design research that is likely to produce outcomes with practical implications and lead to useful recommendations. Scholars need to focus, they need to be able to identify the situations where the policy debate lack clarity, and this is where their expertise can be most useful. And third, and that comes back to some of the points from the findings from the AV and Dash paper, and that's the time element. Research has to be relevant to current events, which will make it relevant for policymakers. Again, as I said, if I'm writing a research now related to events that happened in December 2020, but by the time that it is published, it's going to be December of 2022, then it's not useful to policymakers. So those are very general ideas that how we can do that. But what the scholars in this paper do is that they don't just offer those general ideas, they also offer more concrete uh, steps that we can do in order to what's called bridge this gap. So for example, first thing that should be done by scholars is to foster stronger networking with and creating personal relationship with policymakers. So scholars should be able to interact more easily with policymakers in order to for them to be able to provide this additional information also in a timely manner to policymakers. Scholars need to work in order to position their work within the bureaucratic process by fostering those interrelationship with members of the bureaucratic or members of the government. Scholars can start inject bit by bit, slowly, their insight into the whole bureaucratic process, which takes place from by the time it gets into the bureaucratic process until the time it gets to actual policy decision. There's a lot of steps it has to go through. So by making it part of the process, it's more likely to actually make an effect. And third, and that comes back to providing relevant research, timely research, and ones that policymakers are actually going to read, and that's producing this information in short reports that are being published in non-academic outlets and have clear implications. Writing a 25 long academic research is great if you're an academic, but no policymaker is going to read those kinds of things. If you write it down, if you're able to write it to narrow it down to a one-page summary offering the most clear implications and a policy step that can be based on that, that's a lot more likely to be viewed by policymakers as relevant, and they're likely to read that as well. They also talk about the fact that there are certain scenarios or certain situations where academic input is more likely to be relevant and accepted. For example, during discontinuous events or discontinuous shocks. So for example, everything that happened around 9/11, around the Arab Spring in 2010, the Soviet collapse way back in the 1980s. This is places where expert knowledge about those kinds of topics by scholars can be useful. In phases where there are policy failures, such as the outbreak of insurgency in Iraq in the mid-2000s, this is where the government is facing a lot of challenges, and expert opinion by scholars who are experts on insurgency overall, who are experts on the region of the Middle East, who are experts on Iraq themselves or its own government, can be very useful and provide their information into the actual policy process. And third, as this information can be very useful in when there are all kinds of unexpected decisions where there's lack of a government knowledge, especially in the initial phases. For example, again, the decision by the United States government in the 1990s to intervene in Somalia. In that case, there was not enough information on that area at the time, and expert academic knowledge could have been useful. One more requirement that they add when it comes to researchers, academic researchers, is to scale their expectations about the work and what is it going to do to policymakers. That means that for us as scholars and researchers, we need to figure out what does it mean to be relevant. I want to write a research which is relevant for policymaking about international bargaining between the United States and other countries. I need to first make sure that I understand myself, what does it mean that my research is going to be relevant to policymaking? If I expect to have a substantial effect on shaping policy actions, it's possible, but it's not very likely. Instead, I need to aim more to have an effect on the deliberation process. Why is that? Because overall policymaking involve making decisions which are very high on the pay scale. They are strategic type decisions that are restricted for very senior officials. And most of the people that scholars and researchers are more likely to be associated with, even within the policymaking process, are not likely to be part of this final decisions about policy. Because if I'm able to create connections with members of the State Department, I'm not going to be able to pick up the phone and just text or talk with the Secretary of State in order to generate my information or my expert knowledge about bargaining in international negotiations. But I'm more likely to be in contact with one of the junior deputies and other members of this process. That means my effect is more likely to be on the deliberation process. I'll be able to provide my level of expertise, my knowledge about this topic to more junior members of this process, which contribute their own point to the process of deliberating a specific policy decision. And eventually, it's going to have some effect on the final policy, but not as direct as maybe I would have hoped so. And that's the final point about where academic knowledge can be useful for policymakers. It provides value, mostly in offering contrarian views, because offering expert knowledge from scholars who are not related to the policy process is more likely to be accepted as contrary compared to policy advisors or a member of think tanks, which are a lot closer to the government system. So it's harder for those kinds of people, for policy advisors or similar to them, to provide a contrary argument to an existing policy or any kind of policy idea. For academics, it's a lot easier in that sense. As an example for where academic research can be part of the policy process, we can think about the democratic peace theory, which, as I promised, we'll get to that later in the semester, which was one of the main theories that was promoted by IR scholars in the late 1990s all the way through today. It was first published in the late 1980s, and it took some time, but eventually it became part of the international strategy and national security strategy of two American presidents. It was very influential in the 1996 presidential elections. It was also part of the freedom agenda that was promoted by President George W. Bush following 9/11. So for academic research, even a more general academic theories, it can be part of the policy process. It has to go for those types of steps. All right, that's additional research if you want to read about those topics. There's a link here. As you can see, this is a link to the post by Professor Hendricks. It's actually pretty relevant and something on which I recommend you to read about the links between, as I talked about, this gap between policy and academic research. And this is a more longer study if you're interested in that. With that, I will finish for today. Don't forget to send the attendance word. And as I said on Monday, if you want your pets or your sports teams or your favorite places in the world or in the US to be the background for this lecture, email that to me, and I promise I will add that in later meetings we're going to have. With that, I am done for today, and I will see hopefully some of you at least on Friday for our meeting, and if not, we're going to see you all next week. Bye, everyone.